Hello and welcome. I have a guest with me tonight whom I've known for years and years and years. His name is Paul Lundberg, and we went to college together back in the 60s, Augustana College in Sioux Falls. Paul has recently written a book. It's a book that is a very vivid, riveting book about his family's history when they came from Sweden to America and to Minnesota specifically. It's called Death of a Dream. We're going to talk about that book and about some of the questions and issues that his research raises, that the stories from his family raise. And I'm just delighted he could be here. He lives now in Olympia, Washington. Yes. So you're a long way from home tonight.
I am. And it's very warm here.
It's very muggy and warm here tonight. We're taping in September on the 9th. So we'll be airing this show, Paul, throughout the year here and there. Okay. So it may be a cold winter night when people hear this, but and see it. Well, the name of the book, Death of a Dream, is one that catches one's attention right away. Just in a nutshell, tell us what the title means and why your book is called Death of a Dream.
It does have sort of a morbid sound to it, which people say does not really draw you to it initially, but it refers specifically to the dream of an immigrant family. My great-great-grandparents living in Sweden in the 1800s, realizing that with 7 children and a small piece of land, there was little future for their kids. And they began dreaming a long time before they left. And the plan was to come to America, and with this new start, there would be some sort of security for their children. I like to think that they were like parents today wanting the best for their kids. And this was a big dream, to leave home. They would have been the first in 4 generations that I've tracked back to have left the particular farm they were on. So the magnitude of the dream is really something, I think a very powerful thing. And the dream died. They ran into a terrible tragedy a year after they arrived and settled. They were some of the early victims in what we now call the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. An extended family of 21 persons, and 13 of them were killed. And the aftermath of that is the real tragedy, the struggle for survival that I think went on for generations within the family. I didn't learn of this till late in my own life, and so I know that the prior generations did not do a good job of speaking about it. So it was a huge dream, and it died.
The year we're talking about that they left Sweden was 1861.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that, Paul, because I had relatives coming from Norway, but they came in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. And 20 years earlier, that's an early arrival.
Yes.
For Scandinavian immigrants coming to the Midwest.
The 1860s would have been the beginning, more of a trickle, but the boom started coming each year following. I think I've read once that there were 4 million people from Sweden that ultimately came to the United States over what would have been a 40, 50-year period. So
4 million.
Yeah.
And as I read the book, I thought some too about our whole struggle now with immigration and how we are as a country just so divided and so having such a hard time with it. And here, this is such a story of immigration. A little bit more about the time in Sweden before they left. The Land Reform Act was about to happen.
Yes.
And just in a nutshell, because I think a lot of people might think, why would you leave Sweden to come here? But that was one of the reasons.
Right. Ironically, times were getting better in Sweden. Some historians talk about peace, pox, and potatoes. Mm-hmm. Smallpox
nice alliteration.
Smallpox vaccine, potatoes as a new crop that could be grown in Sweden, and Sweden was not at war with anybody. It was a relative time of prosperity, But that put greater pressure on the land as more and more families were getting larger, less infant mortality, and so the prosperity made things more difficult. There were people felt a bit of oppression from the church with, I think they wielded power over the citizens, and this was certainly an issue. Other factors were in it, but I think with many people, it could have been the spirit of adventure. I learned that my ancestors were not poor peasants. They had managed to accumulate a decent farm. I've seen the records of their land holdings they had a small brewery, which was a sign of prosperity. And so they did their planning well and sold their land, sold their farm before the Land Reform Act came, and then rented until they had accumulated enough money to make the big trip.
So unlike a lot of people who did come from Europe and from Scandinavia because they weren't going to make it at home, your family was making it.
They were. They were.
But still better a possible prosperity as they looked west.
Yep. And then doing it as 3 households, my great-great-grandparents, the Lundborgs, and then 2 Broberg families. They were all cousins, and they had lived in the same area, and I know they must have talked about this on cold winter nights for a long time.
Your research was something you must have worked for years and years on. And just tell us a bit about how you pieced it all together, because if you buy the book and read the book, you'll see that the research was tremendous. I mean, you really dug into the lives of these people and of the times.
Most of the research took place after I retired in 2006.
And we should mention that Paul, and I failed to mention that Paul was a Lutheran minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America for
37 years.
37 years.
Yep,
So.
retired in 2006. Some really strong experience came in this whole research process, which began at age 38. I learned this story from an aunt that I had never heard growing up.
And why do you think that was something that was not told to you earlier? It's such a major family history.
My best hunch, and that's all it is that it's a cultural issue where people hate to talk about the difficult experiences of life, the darker side of life. A family, my great-grandfather lost his 3 brothers. His younger brother was wounded, but 3 brothers killed in this incident. And
it's amazing your great-grandfather survived. I mean, he was the oldest of all the men.
Right. When I first heard this story, the impact in my mind was, if he wouldn't have survived, I wouldn't be here. And so it's a very personal kind of feeling. So hearing the story at age 38, upon retirement in 2006, going to Sweden, seeing the places, finding the place where they came from, that was a rich experience. Working with a genealogist who had all of the church records of Sweden at her disposal on the internet, but she could translate them, interpret and translate, and that made such a huge difference. And then I met local historians in the area who knew the oral history.
And sometimes that must have been fascinating.
Yeah, sometimes those two don't agree. The oral historians and the academic historians don't always see it the same way. So I got different perspectives on all of that. So it's been a rich experience searching this out.
And when it's obvious in seeing your eyes sparkle that you've loved the research and loved the learning, but also the sadness of what they went through and the tragedy. Has that impacted you in the way you think about life and about your life in particular?
Yeah, it has. My dad died when I was 10 years old, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons I missed out on a lot of the story, because I didn't have a lot of contact with my Lundborg relatives from that point on. And so, kind of a personal quest to fill in some missing pieces in my own life. And as that started to happen, I realized I really need to tell this to my family. I want to convey this to them. And then the next progression along the way was, this is more than a family story. This hits some universal notes in family life, the story of immigrant families who have suffered, the story of refugee families caught as victims in a war. Those kind of stories have gone on for centuries. And I think this resonates with those stories.
As I read the book, I looked for parts where you would recognize that it wasn't just a tragedy for the Swedish immigrants,
Right.
but also for many of the native people.
Oh, very much
And
so.
your ability to be able to see it from both sides, Paul, I thought was wonderful, because it was a tragedy on
It was.
so many levels.
A statewide tragedy. What this war hurt Minnesota in so many ways. 650 civilian casualties, the most of any state that had Indian wars that they fought. That was huge. This largest mass execution, simultaneous mass execution of 38 Dakota Braves. There's never been anything like that in the United States before. So huge impact on both sides. And I understand my white settler ancestors.
Sure.
I can't experience the Dakota part of this tragedy like they do, but I'm so eager for these stories to somehow come together that I don't want to stop my story. I want to have my story invite something from the Dakota people too. I did have this one experience of
That you write about with
Eugene Crawford, a Dakota man who married a Danish Lutheran woman and became a Lutheran. He helped sponsor this conference where I went with a number of other white Christian pastors. This was held in the Pacific Northwest back in 1983. And this was a couple of years after I learned the story, and I was alone with Eugene one day, and I thought, I need to tell him this. I knew he was Dakota, and I was taking kind of a chance by saying it, and so I said, as I told him the whole story, if my great-grandfather wouldn't have lived, I wouldn't be here. And then it's sort of dawned on me, at least now, I basically told him, your people killed mine. And he was silent for a minute, and then he said, my great-grandfather was one of the 38 who were hanged. And he was saying, your people killed mine. And there was a long silence. And we had simply told our stories to each other, and a strong bond was made that we appreciated for that week. We shared a little bit of communication, and about 3 years later, when he died, his wife sent me a kind note. I really appreciated that. And
that was the sign, wasn't it, that your friendship with him had
Yes.
been special. I mean,
Yes.
a widow doesn't write to very many people
No.
that were at that level of acquaintance.
Yep. And I'm eager for other people to possibly experience something like that when you simply tell your story, and Eugene just listened to me. And then I heard his story. We didn't try to outdo each other with who had the worst and the most and all of that. The stories stood there side by side, and a bond was formed.
Neither one of you ran away from the other,
No.
which would have been easy to do
Right.
for a lot of people.
Yeah.
This is too intense or too awkward, or there's too much, water over the dam here.
Right.
One of the things you write in the book is that you hope we learn from this story, from our history. What do you think has been the learning that for you has been most interesting or most telling?
Recently, I read an article in the New York Times. Bruce Feiler wrote Walking the Bible. He's Jewish man, essayist, author. he wrote about how important it is for a family to have a family narrative that we pass on to our children, that they have some understanding of what does it mean to be a Smith, a Jones, whoever. He said children who have a sense of their family narrative endure challenges much easier. And the family narrative can be as simple as, I know how my parents met, or I know my grandparents' names. Or he says you can get into it, is your narrative one of ascendancy or descendancy? Are you on an upward climb, a downward one? Children need to know that they're part of something bigger than themselves. And that's what all of this has meant to me in the process of that missing spot from when my dad died has been filled many, many times over.
That's a real gift,
with a
isn't
sense
it?
of belonging to a greater family. We had an experience last summer, 2012, on the 150th anniversary of this killing. And we brought together the descendants of the survivors. We didn't have lists. We had word of mouth contacts, and 150 people showed up.
Wow.
Most of us had never met the rest of us, and we had this one story in common.
And you gathered
At the place, Lake
the
Munson State Park.
There's a state park now, which I had not
Right.
heard of that state
Yeah.
park, Paul.
Yep.
Lake Munson State Park.
Outside of Sunburg.
Check that on the map.
Yeah, outside of Sunburg, Minnesota, 20 miles from Wilmer, and
20 miles, what direction?
northwest of Wilmer.
Northwest, okay.
Yeah. And so we spent a day together and just spent our time talking about this event. And I'm meeting some of those people again on this trip, and they're saying how much they appreciated that. And so a lot of people have gained a sense of belonging to this larger family. That this has made it very worthwhile.
That's a very interesting point that the New York Times writer makes. Just a quick aside, if your family is on the descending kind of trip, that could be very hard for a young person, couldn't it?
It would be hard for it, but if you at least can understand it.
That's
If you're
true.
descending, you were at another point
Right,
previously.
and maybe you can get back there.
Right, right. And if a family verbalizes that and says, this is who we are, we're having difficult times, I think there's just some real truth to what he wrote.
Well, understanding is huge, whether it's hard stuff or good stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it really does lead us. When the horrible incident occurred, can you just tell us a little bit about that day? Because
Sure.
that's the part of the book that just sticks with a person, and it's so dramatic. And we don't have very
Yeah.
many minutes, but just tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about how that happened.
August 20th, 1862, they had been living in America for a year. Their pastor came to visit them in the middle of the week. A worshipful gathering was held. One of the children who'd been left behind in another cabin came over and interrupted the conclusion by saying, "The Indians are here and they're acting strangely and we're frightened."
And at that point, and I read that and I thought, that little boy came a couple miles.
By himself.
And he was 7 or 8 or 9.
Yes.
I mean, that's a long ways to travel as a young child
Yes.
with this horrible, fear.
Right, right. And that broke up the service, and all of the adults and everybody there left to go back to the other cabin. A group in a wagon, a group on foot. And as they all came back there, that's when the killings happened. 13 people, including a 10-month-old child. I think the oldest person killed would have been 43, but mostly young people.
And you described the mothers as running, scattering with their little
Right.
children. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just
It's a horrific story to
horrible.
tell, and one thing that helped me in telling it was I had the pastor's voice narrating it, the pastor who had presided at it, looking back years later, remembering it. Even to write out the details, the biographical details, it's way too harsh. And so that enabled me to say it in a way that conveyed the message without turning it into just a gory sort of story. But the truth of it all was this horrific tragedy.
Our government really should be much held responsible for what went down. I mean, they reneged on their promises to pay the Indians to feed them. I mean, there were so many things that went wrong at that level.
Yeah.
And I don't know that our government has ever really, I mean, we don't even learn much about this war in history.
Right.
I mean, because it was right during the Civil War
Right.
time,
Yeah, so much
that's
going on.
one reason. But I almost wonder if it's like, you know, trying to cover up this horrible chapter too.
It's easy in hindsight to look back and see all of this, so I try to bite my tongue just a little bit. But the one fact that made so much sense to me that said the United States government sort of willed this is that they were surveying that land in 1820. The Louisiana Purchase took place in
Right.
1803. In
Right.
1820, they were surveying it. So when you survey land, you're talking about buying and selling and owning. And this was the concept that was so alien to the Dakota people. And there was no effort to sort of work through this cultural interchange of different values. It was just, here's how it is. And it's easier to get angrier at that impersonal force
Yes.
in hindsight and just say there really was not much will to alter this.
But it also then, if we think, what do we learn from this, makes me think, you know, as citizens, we need to question,
Yeah.
to push, to
Yeah.
ask for reasons for action. And of course, back in those days, you know, as you and I were saying, communication was
Right, right.
so very, very
And it was such a
basic.
new country.
Right.
All of these newcomers, accustomed to a different way of government. I think of my ancestors coming in. Who would they protest to? Who would they say, we don't know if you're doing this right, authorities? So I like to think, maybe some others would say, well, these settlers were evil, wicked people stealing land. My perception of them is that they were naive, little concept that somebody could see land as other than something, a commodity to buy and sell. And they had never been with people of another culture. The aliens to them were Norwegians and Danes.
And they were quite at war with each other too, as your book describes.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, much more angry and tense than I had realized.
Some of it is funny, and so
And we can chuckle now.
Right. There's one story. Pastor Andrew Jackson, my family's pastor, becomes the presiding president or the institutional president of Gustavus Adolphus College at its beginnings. And he one day was complaining about a Norwegian Lutheran pastor coming there, and that Norwegian Lutheran pastor became the founding president of St. Olaf College. I hope they both grew past the...
Yeah, it's just, there is humor now. I want to just pause and give the viewers a couple resource pieces so that if you want to learn more about this book, and I'll hold it up in a minute. The title of the book, though, again, is Death of a Dream, One Family's Experience of the 1862 U.S. Dakota War. And Paul, who is with me, is the author, of course. And if you would like to find the book, you can get it via Amazon. So Amazon.com.
Yes.
And on your tour now, you're selling
Yes, we are.
selling books like hotcakes.
Yeah.
I want to hold it up so that you can see the cover. And Paul and I were talking about what a very apt cover this is for this book.
The Swedish Dala horse was kind of a marker that you were from Sweden, even back in the 1860s.
It would be
And
one of those special things you brought
yeah.
over.
And the owl feather was very important in the ceremonies of the Dakota people. the artist Susan Volkman, who did this. I was just very pleased with her work.
Well, yeah, I think the cover is just perfect for the book. There's one other site that you should know about. The Minnesota Historical Site has a wonderful section on the U.S.-Dakota War that you might want to check out. Well, we have time just for one last question, Paul. Other ideas that you might have for reconciliation as a pastor, as a leader? What comes to mind when you think of this period in our history?
I guess I tend to think in a very personal way about individuals getting together and telling their stories to each other, some sort of way of bringing descendants of the settlers, descendants of the Dakota together to do that. The story, I think, becomes so interesting because a lot of people still don't know any of this history. Mm-hmm. I think they have to come to know it well enough to let go of it. Mm. You have to know what happened in a way that satisfies you, and then you can let it go. That's one of the strategies I would see.
You sound like a psychologist as well as a pastor. That's a very insightful, great idea. Well, thank you so much, Paul.
You're welcome.
For coming and talking about this wonderful book, Death of a Dream.
I'm thankful to have been with you.
Thank you for being with us. We'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.